a special program with Professor Mulcahy, and he is going to do magic, mathematics, and mystery of Martin Gardner. So welcome and enjoy yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for taking time off during your lunch break. My plan is to speak for about 30 or 35 minutes and do it again at 12:45, so if you're at the meeting over at the Ritz-Carlton, you'll still have time for lunch. We had hoped to do a little projection, but that's not going to work right now, so I want to point out that I have 5 or 6 handouts here that you're welcome to take at the end of the presentation. You can come up and grab them now if you like. They concern puzzles that were popularized by Martin Gardner, and this one is actually quite amusing because it's two-sided. This was invented by somebody more recently, and it's two-sided, and if you hold it one way you see one thing, and if you turn it upside down you see something else. And there's a surprise because the two sides are subtly different. So you need to take 2 and figure out how they are different and turn them upside down, and different words appear, and they're actually written on the top, so you get a tip off if you get stuck. But I'm here to talk about a man called Martin Gardner. I was very fortunate to get to know Martin in the last decade or so of his life. He was a great American man of numbers and letters. And he passed away about 2 years ago at the age of 95 and a half. He started publishing when he was 15 and a half. So if you do the mathematics, this man published for 80 years, which is quite extraordinary. He published a lot of pamphlets on magic when he was very young, and then as time went by he started writing books. He wrote magazine articles for Scientific American, which were very popular from the 1950s through the 1980s. And in fact, I've been told both by people in the publishing industry that the sales of Scientific American were boosted for those 25 years because a lot of people just wanted to read his monthly column. And secondly, that when he stopped writing for it, a lot of people just didn't bother buying the magazine anymore because he wasn't writing for it. So a lot of people were turned on to recreational mathematics and magic and illusion and other things that Martin was interested in through his extensive and very, very popular and very influential writings. Now, as we look back, it appears that he published about 80 different books, which is quite remarkable, over an 80-year period. And the library has some on display over here. They even have a couple I've never seen before, and one I've never heard of before. You never know when you're going to find something new by Martin. I have some up here on display that I'll talk about shortly. One borrowed from the library and the rest are mine. You're welcome to come up and take a look at them afterwards. But I want to start by telling you a story about the first time I personally met Martin. We started corresponding in about 1999. I was interested in mathematical magic, especially to do with cards. And I had written up some notes, and I shared them with some people, and one person said to me, "I think Martin Gardner would like these." And my internal response, which I didn't verbalize, was, "Martin's still alive?" Because I read him when I was a teenager, a long time ago. And in fact, this book here I bought in 22nd of November 1975. I was a first-year student at the University in Ireland. I bought this in Dublin. And, you know, I hadn't heard about him a whole lot since then. I was paying attention to a different kind of mathematics, not so much recreation, more research. I honestly didn't know that he was still publishing. He was publishing books and so on. But I did send him those notes, and he sent back some nice comments, and we started a dialogue, and we used to telephone. And then eventually I got to visit him. I got to go out and meet him a few times. He spent his working life, he was born in Oklahoma in 1914, and he grew up in Oklahoma, and as a young man went to the University of Chicago, from which he obtained a degree in 1936, as I recall. He then worked for the University of Chicago press office, and he had inside information that he wasn't allowed to talk about. He knew about the Manhattan Project. Come 1941, Pearl Harbor happens, and like many, many hundreds of thousands of young American men, he enlisted. And he enlisted for the Navy. And it was basically the only time he traveled outside the US. He didn't like travel. He was kind of a home bird. He liked his home comforts. He used to go to Canada a little bit because he had some magician friends there. But he didn't travel to England, to my knowledge, or anywhere else other than in the Navy. And he did 3 or 4 years tour of duty in the Navy. But a story he told me once that made a big impression on me was that a couple of days after Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, he was on a ship in the Pacific as an enlisted man. And the captain of the ship made an announcement. He said, "Men, something terrible has happened. There's been this big bomb that we have dropped on the Japanese, and we hope it's going to be the beginning of the end of the war. And everybody said, whatever, another bomb. And he, because of his insider knowledge from having worked for the University of Chicago press office many years earlier, he said he knew what it was. He knew it was an atomic bomb, and he didn't think anybody else in the boat knew that, including the captain. And he said he knew it was the beginning of a new age in humanity, and he just felt very conflicted about that. He lived his professional life in Chicago as a writer at first, and then he moved to New York City, I believe, in the mid-50s. He was very lucky to get a job writing about mathematics. And he actually wrote for Scientific American starting in the late 1956, I believe. He wrote once a month, and he was in a very unique position in that he was very well connected with young mathematicians and some established mathematicians who gave him material that he was able to write about. He researched in the library, 42nd Street in Manhattan, week after week, and basically for 3 weeks out of 4, he just wrote a single column. That was his day job, 9 to 5. In the evenings, he did other stuff. He wrote fiction, he wrote magic stuff for children, and so on. But he basically had a full-time job, and all he had to do was produce 1 column a month. So he had an enormous amount of time to produce a quality column. And it ran, as I said, for 25 or 30 years. And several people tried to take over from him when he retired from that. And essentially, nobody had the breadth of interest and depth of interest that he had. People wrote about specific things, but he just covered such a broad spectrum of things. Many of the mathematical topics that the public knows about today were first introduced by Martin Gardner. Origami, which is a paper folding art of Japanese origin. There's going to be a presentation about it here tomorrow, I believe, at 11 o'clock in this very spot. That's something that he wrote about in his column back in the 1960s, and it was new to most Americans at the time, and it just became very popular. There's interesting mathematical questions you can answer and ask. It's still a research area today about origami. The Mandelbrot set in fractals is something that nobody heard of until about 1980-81. It was Martin who wrote about that first and brought us those beautiful pictures which have spawned so much art and mathematics since. He also was responsible for Escher, the Dutch artist's work, being popularized outside of Holland. And he had an original Escher print in his room, which I saw several times. He paid $50 for it, autographed by Escher. God knows what it's worth today, but a lot more. And he was the person who turned on people to Escher's art, which has some connections with illusion and so on. He wrote about magic a lot. He liked mathematical magic. He liked card tricks. Since our projection system is down and I'm doing something a little different from what I'd originally planned, I will show you a card trick at the end. And there'll be one more piece of paper, I think it's bright orange, that you might want to take with you so that you can reproduce this card trick yourself. But it's based on some interesting mathematics. And I came up with it a few years ago and I showed it to Martin and he liked it. It usually goes down pretty well. So what's surprising about Martin is he published a lot of magic. He started when he was 15 and a half. In April of 1930, he published his first magic trick. And his last published article, to my knowledge, was in the spring of the year he died, just a couple of weeks before he died, and that would have been 2 years ago. And that article was called Oprah Winfrey, Bright but Gullible Billionaire. Now, Oprah had bought into some faith healer type stuff, and Martin was particularly upset about anybody smart who bought into alternative medicines that, could harm people because they chose not to seek real medication. A famous example would be the English comedian and actor Peter Sellers, who about 1980 went to the Philippines to one of these guys to have, one of these people who would kind of put his hands on your tummy and pretend to put his hand inside and pull out the bad organ, and all he's got in his hand is a piece of chicken liver, and he just pops a little blood vessel at a certain time. It's a standard magic trick, it's a standard scam that's been done all over the world for thousands of years. People bought into it. Peter Sellers died because he did not seek real medical attention. And that kind of thing really upset Martin. In fact, his first book was published in 1952, and it was about fads and fallacies in the name of science. That was his very first book. His second book was 1956, and that was called Mathematics, Magic and Mystery, which is where I've stolen my title from. And it's right here. And it's a very nice book. It's still in print. Dover published it, and they have a stand across there at the hotel. He kindly autographed it for me a few years ago. And it's still a classic book. It's about the kind of magic you can do with simple objects, but magic that uses some mathematical principles. Think back to the 30s, 40s. What did people do? They congregated together and they did magic with matches and cigarettes and lighters and You know, just props that we don't perhaps use today as much. But also cards and rubber bands, and there's all sorts of fascinating stuff in here. He was fortunate to know a lot of the magicians who were developing and inventing this material in the 40s and the 50s. And he asked their permission to, you know, publish some of their stuff. And they didn't think the book was going to sell much. So they said, yeah, whatever, which magicians usually don't. And the book has never been out of print. So some of them, I think, had pangs of regret that their secrets were revealed to the general public. But they're not the kind of flashy stuff that, you know, David Blaine and Penn and Teller do. Although those guys also do use mathematical magic, I should point out. Martin published an enormous amount. He's most famous for his Scientific American columns. And they're all collected into one little shiny disc. And there it is, and you can get it for about $30 or $40. It's 300 of his columns as a searchable PDF. And the searchable part's useful because I was looking for something about a year ago. There was an Irish magician, an Irish mathematician that Martin used to correspond with called Victor Mealy, and I didn't know much about him, and I couldn't remember his name. So I just opened up the DVD and I put in a search engine and I put in the word Ireland, which is where I'm from too. And the first thing I got was a publisher called Ireland, and that wasn't what I wanted at all. But then I quickly found references to this fellow from Ireland, Victor Mealy, and then I was able to solve my mystery, which was who was Victor Mealy and why was he writing to Martin. So it's very useful to be able to search a 300 document, you know, manuscript essentially. They were originally published in books. Well, the second time around in books. I bought this, and it's got about a dozen of the Scientific American columns in it, maybe 15. So 15 or 16 of these books came out, but they're all in one place here. And they're on paper form, and I highly recommend it. So again, Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science was his first publication in the early 50s, which debunked science, pseudoscience, and L. Ron Hubbard and a lot of other things. And he also became a founding member of the American Skeptical Society. In fact, they're the ones who published the article on Oprah Winfrey, which you can get on the web free. This was his second book, which, you know, got the interest of mathematicians, and it kind of coincided with him starting to write for Scientific American, which is where he became most famous. But he did a lot of other stuff, and two of his other books that are quite famous are two magic books, which are this size. I mean, they're hefty. They're the size of telephone books. They're 500 or 600 pages. They're very hard to get. You will not find these in your local bookshop. They're kind of insider magician books. You can find them on the web if you know where to look, but they're not so easy to get, and I paid a pretty penny for these because they're out of print. This one appears to be called Martin Gardner Presents, but I always think of it as Martin Gardner Presents, because when I'm stuck for ideas, I just open this up and I get an idea and I think, hey, I could turn it into a magic trick or change it into a different magic trick. This is magic trick. But he wrote two books like this that were published in maybe the 90s, 80s and 90s, which just assemble a vast amount of original material that he'd written going back to the 1930s. His best-selling book has nothing to do with mathematics, or does it? The annotated Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, and so on. I'm not a personal Alice in Wonderland fan, but he wrote this book in 1960, I believe, and it sold 500,000 copies to date. It's his biggest seller. He was obsessed with Lewis Carroll, among other writers who, you know, didn't have immediate connections to mathematics. But I said I was going to tell you about the first time I met him. The first time I met him, I went out to see him in a retirement community in Oklahoma. He lived in New York, he lived in Chicago, then New York, then he lived in Hendersonville, North Carolina for about 10 years, and his wife passed away a while back, and then he eventually resettled back in his home state of Oklahoma, where one of his sons is a professor at the university. So he's just a few miles down from his son, and I went out to see him, and he had a nice space in this retirement community, and he said to me, I want to show you something and get your opinion. And I'm going to twist it a little bit and ask you this question. We have 4 cans here. There seems to be a food theme. Coffee, Pringles, and chipotle peppers and adobo sauce. Not the healthiest lunch. My question to you is the following. For which of these cans is it true that it is taller than it is around? And perhaps many times taller. This one looks like it may be maybe twice as high as it is around. This one looks like it might be 3 times as tall as it's around, whatever. You might have a different opinion. Maybe our visual judgment is a little shaky sometimes about girth. You know, we're all in denial that we're putting on weight. But what do you think? For which of these 4 cans, 1, 2, 3, 4, do you think it's taller than it is around?
Pringles.
Pringles. Anybody else think, how about this one? Is that one big enough?
Yes.
Yes, no, maybe? Well, let me give you a hint. I'm going to replace the Pringles can with another can that's almost identical.